Welcome, everybody, to episode 18 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined, as always, by Bill Roggio, my colleague. Bill.
Hi, everyone.
This week, we're going to talk a little bit about the Russian bounty story. If you've been following the news, you know that these are the reports that began in the New York Times that the Russians have offered bounties to the Taliban to kill and maim American soldiers in Afghanistan. Bill and I are going to give you guys our skeptical take on that story and some of our thoughts on it. And we're also going to talk about the Taliban's reaction to a piece that was put up at Long War Journal, the website, by Caleb Weiss, who's a grad student who writes for us. We think there's a lot of interesting details surrounding that story just because of the reaction to it and sort of how basic the facts are and how the Taliban is so desperate to deny the presence of any foreign jihadis in Afghanistan. Before we start with the substantive conversation, I'd like to give you sort of a little preview of where things are going. As you guys know, we started this podcast earlier this year. We were late adopters of the podcast format. Bill and I, as we've discussed many times through the year, stink at marketing ourselves, right? You agree with that, Bill, right?
I might be the world's worst self-marketer on the, yeah, we're terrible.
Yeah, I don't like self-promotion. I mean, everybody has to do it. I mean, it's all sort of the bullshit game that everybody plays is promoting their stuff. Everybody gets on Twitter and says, "Oh, look at what I wrote today," and I've just sort of had a hard time doing that, even that much all along. But everybody is into self-promotion and marketing, and we've really stunk at it for a long time. But with the podcast, we wanted to give you guys a different sense of sort of where sort of our behind-the-scenes look at how we're thinking about the stories of the day and what's going on. We're putting a lot of effort into trying to expand the podcast going forward. And doing that, what we want to do is we also want to sort of provide some marketing, for what we're doing. And so Bill and Phil Hegseth, who's working with us on the podcast, have been talking about different types of merchandise that we're going to try and do with some donations. Now, to give you a sense of how bad we are at marketing, Bill and I was trying to think back through this, Bill. I think we started talking about doing merchandise at the Long War Journal, in 2009?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
And here we are in 2020, the Afghan war's still going, but we don't have any merchandise, So, it sort of shows how ridiculous we are at all this, ridiculously bad at it. But okay, so we're going to do that. We're going to have some merchandise. We're also going to set up a place for you guys to donate. We are going to ask for donations to pay for different contributors, pay for different expenses for hosting the podcast and some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. Also for some translation work that we're doing. We've got some interesting analyses coming of stuff that's been recently translated. Sort of just to basically keep the lights on and keep it going. We're very thankful to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and all the support we've gotten from Cliff May, our boss, and Mark Dubowitz and others there through the years. But we are ultimately beholden to donors to keep us going. And so we're going to ask for some donations to keep this podcast going and keep some of the other work that we're doing going and hopefully expand in some ways. Right, Bill?
Yep, we'd love to. There's more we'd love to do. What Tom's talking about on the translations, we've run across some fascinating things. We're still working through the Bin Laden files. There's just a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and unfortunately, some of it requires money.
Yeah, and we're want to move forward with the translations of what Al-Qaeda is saying in Urdu. We don't have any Urdu capacity in Long War Journal. We do have Arabic, but not Urdu. And so we found, I put a tweet out a couple weeks ago now, I think, asking for any Urdu translators. We found some guys that are doing this stuff. And what's interesting about that is that, one of the things that Bill and I have come across through the years is that the U.S. Government, sort of writ large, has been very interested in anything, or at times, not all the time, but at times has been interested in anything written in Arabic by Al-Qaeda, but has sort of ignored the fact that Al-Qaeda is not just an Arabic institution, has been writing in multiple languages, and of course so is Islamic State, the spin-off from Al-Qaeda that mushroomed into its own so-called caliphate. They produce material in multiple different languages, but we're very interested in what Al-Qaeda is saying in Urdu because they're revealing all sorts of details about what's going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan that you probably haven't heard of. Stuff that we were generally aware of, but we're getting more detail. And so translating that stuff, look, we want to pay for some translators to do that. We found a couple, and so that's part of what we want to do to help raise money. But that's just one of many things we're looking at, right, Bill?
Yep, that's right. And look, the bias that if it's in Arabic, it's interesting, and if it's Urdu, that it's not. These are, the U.S. government should be very interested in what Al Qaeda has to say in languages like Urdu, and yet these stories aren't being the Al Qaeda's magazines aren't being translated, because if it's Urdu, then it's not interesting, and it just makes no sense. And yeah, that's what these are the barriers that we run into, and that we're looking to break down, and that's going to come with your support.
There also was this, we've also run into this numerous times through the years of people think of Al Qaeda as an Arabic institution, as, because it's founded by Arabs, run by Arabs. And that, yes, absolutely, it's a fundamentally, foundationally, it was an Arabic institution, Arabic organization. But, the idea that it's solely Arabic and that only Arabs in Afghanistan could possibly be Al Qaeda, it's just really a phony assumption, a faulty assumption. You can see, we've been tracking this for a long time. You can see that Al Qaeda is producing a lot of material in Urdu and other languages, Pashto, basically out of the region, and to discount that and pretend that that's not Al Qaeda because it's not in Arabic, which is what some do, is just wrong.
Yeah, it's absolutely wrong. Al Qaeda has leaned heavily on people from Afghanistan and Pakistan, particularly Urdu speakers, Pashto speakers, to add to that deep bench that it has for its leadership. And look, Al Qaeda is able to get away with hiding its operations in Afghanistan merely by publishing its statements of what it's doing in Urdu and just not having them in Arabic or in English. And we just think it's just an important part of the story that needs to be told, and it's just astounding to us that this information isn't getting out there.
Yeah, and this is a good example, too, of why we stink at marketing. As you see, this started with just sort of a cursory sort of overview of what we're going to ask for money, and we end up in a nerdy conversation about the flaws in Al-Qaeda analysis. So this is the way things go. But let's get on to the Russian bounty story. We're recording this on, let me look up the data. During the pandemic, I've been terrible at keeping track on the data.
July 10th, Tom, I got you.
July 10th. All right, thanks. So it's July 10th. We're recording this. It's gonna be released in a few days. This week there have been a few hearings on the Hill, delving into the Russian bounty story. The Russian bounty story was first reported by the New York Times on June 26th, and the report was that basically the GRU, the military intelligence unit, of the Kremlin branch of the Kremlin, a unit of the GRU. Basically had offered to pay bounties to the Taliban to target Americans in Afghanistan. And Bill and I read the report, and we've been sort of digging into this and talking to people and doing our own thinking and research on it. And we're sort of skeptical from this perspective, I think. And Bill, obviously, you're going to fill in anything I leave out here in the sort of overview. We're skeptical from the perspective of, first of all, does the Taliban need Russian bounties to hunt Americans in Afghanistan? No. That's what they've been doing since 2001, since they were ejected from Afghanistan in 2001. I don't know why the Taliban would need extra incentive or extra pay to do that. Two, I think, when you look at the reporting, it's not even clear who within the Taliban was allegedly offered these bounties. Was it the Taliban itself, or was it sort of criminal elements associated with the Taliban? That's a weird angle to it, because, obviously there are multiple actors in Afghanistan that could be offered this. And why does that matter? Well, I think that bleeds into number 3, which is that so far, as we're a couple weeks in the reporting on this, and we'll update things as the information is updated. We're a couple weeks into this, and nobody can point to any specific attacks that were paid for by the Russians. There's one attack that's been mentioned, which is the April 2019 bombing outside of Bagram. Bill and I are going to get into that. It's outside Bagram, right, Bill? I think that's the one I wrote.
Yes, it was. Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
Right. So we'll talk a little bit about that attack and why that doesn't look to us like a bounty-funded operation, but who knows? Obviously Russians could have paid cash behind the scenes. Then the fourth thing is, Russia certainly is a nefarious actor. It's an anti-American actor. They have all sorts of incentives to target the Americans in Afghanistan. I don't doubt that this is something that was sort of in the bloodstream or in sort of the intelligence reporting to some degree. But, there are all sorts of bad actors in Afghanistan. And when it comes to the Taliban in particular, its sponsors are, chiefly Pakistan. And then the Iranians have played a role. And then Bill and I are going to walk through different Gulf states who have offered their soil for fundraising apparatus for the Taliban through the years. So, it's sort of interesting to watch how Russia, anything Russia related, gets gets the front page splash and leads to congressional hearings and everything else. Whereas these other angles of the story have sort of taken a back seat. And that sort of, I think, has to do more with our domestic political framing than it does with the actual reality of what's going on in Afghanistan. Is there anything else on the summary, Bill, before we dive in that you would add to that?
No, Tom, I think that sums it up just about right.
All right, so let's get into it a little bit. So the first thing is, let's talk about, the Taliban and whether or not they need Russian bounties to incentivize sort of their men to go out and attack Americans. I mean, they've been waging war in Afghanistan since they were ejected from power in 2001. Afghanistan is an incredibly violent place. You're talking about, I think some of the reporting that came out for just the fourth quarter of 2019, you're talking about thousands of attacks over a period of 3 months. Since the American Taliban withdrawal deal was signed on February 29th, the Taliban has claimed hundreds of attacks in that period, and as really the reporting indicates, they've launched thousands of attacks. And basically, when you look at this, they're saying the Russians sort of had to provide a bounty to Taliban fighters to come get Americans, to come attack Americans, and I just don't. I don't see. I mean, certainly that's possible. I think it's I don't doubt that the Russians may have offered this in some regard. All the reporting seems to suggest there's something to the reporting, even though there's some dissent within the intelligence community on exactly what it means. But, I mean, Bill, the Taliban doesn't need Russian money to attack Americans, right?
No, they don't. I mean, the reality is they've been attacking Americans in Afghanistan since 2001. If the Russians were adding to this, when did this when did the supposed bounties start? Who, as you said, which groups were contacted?
So the reporting says it may have started as early as 2017, 2018, but then the only example that I've seen is specific examples from April 2019, which we're going to talk about. The thing is, has Russia supplied the Taliban with light arms and other support and sort of hosted them diplomatically in a series of sort of sessions that were meant to counter America's diplomatic efforts and American power and the Afghan government's legitimacy? Yeah, Moscow did all that for sure. I don't have any doubt of that, and I don't have any doubt they're supplying some arms and other things. And I don't really doubt that they would offer bounties, or somebody in the GRU could offer bounties. I don't really have any reason to doubt that in itself. But I just the motive here, or the necessity of it, is what I sort of question from the get-go.
Yeah, it's not like the Taliban wouldn't be targeting Americans if the Russians weren't offering bounties. Their website over the past 2 decades, while the URL for Voice of Jihad has changed quite a bit, it celebrates every time it kills or injures an American soldier in one of its attacks. So if these bounties started in 2017 or 2018 or 2019, it doesn't fundamentally change anything on the ground. That's the key point here. It's the Taliban were going to, up until that withdrawal deal was signed on February 29th of this year, the Taliban were going to attack U.S. servicemen in Afghanistan with or without bounties.
But the thing is, when you look back through the whole history here too, I was talking to a reporter about it. I was like, why is the April 2019 attack? Let's segue to that part of it. So
sure,
this is an attack in April of 2019. Outside of Bagram. You and I were talking about this when this attack surfaced as sort of the suspected operation that was funded by Russian bounties. All right, look, so we covered that operation at the time, that attack at the time. 3 Americans were killed. Several other people were wounded. You look at it, the Taliban quickly claimed responsibility for it, through all their official channels. Their cutout spokesman on Twitter immediately had a tweet celebrating this quote-unquote martyr for the cause. And this is another interesting thing about that. So there are a couple different aspects of this that are interesting. First of all, the Taliban immediately claimed it, which doesn't strike me as consistent with a bounty operation, right? I mean, it's not like, if it were a criminal element being funded by the Russians to conduct it, why would the Taliban be claiming it through its hierarchy, through its official media apparatus, right?
They don't claim credit for attacks that they don't do. I've yet to detect that from the Taliban. That's not to say that's not possible, but there's reasons for that. Some of them are religious because everything is, all these attacks are based on fatwas. And some of it is like the people that conduct operations in these areas are going to know. And it creates all kinds of problems for the Taliban to claim credit for attack that it did not do.
Yeah. And so, the thing is, they could, Russians could have, funded the Taliban directly to carry on an attack. But again, why is that any different from what the Taliban's been doing all along? So you look at Bagram. So you and I have been covering the attacks in and around Bagram for, a long time now. There's so many attacks. Going back to, there was a suicide bomber in 2007 that hit Bagram looking to try and kill Vice President Cheney or attack while he was there. Sure. There's been all sorts of other operations. There was a suicide bombing right in or near Bagram in December of 2019, months after this one that was supposedly funded by the Russian Bounties. And they also launch their rockets or missiles at Bagram routinely. There's just really dozens and dozens of attacks by the Taliban at this target through the years. So the target is not a new target for the Taliban, right? They do this thing all the time. And then it was a suicide bombing, which is an interesting thing. The Taliban claimed it was a suicide bombing. I didn't see anything in the initial reporting about this, whether it be the New York Times or Associated Press, by officials recognizing it was a suicide bombing, which I think is a little curious because a suicide bombing obviously brings an ideological dimension to it. Yeah, somebody could, need cash for their family. The family of the quote-unquote martyr could want money after a suicide bombing. We know the jihadi groups do that. They pay the martyrs' families, suicide bombers' families. But Taliban has plenty of cash of its own to pay. They don't need Russian bounties to do that. So I think that's an interesting angle to this too. Right? Bill, talk a little bit about how the Taliban celebrates martyrdom and suicide attacks. This is a core part of their ideology and their operations.
Yeah, no, it is. The suicide bomber, that's considered, as well as those who conduct those, what we call a suicide assault, where they'll storm a building and they know they're going to die. They're held in the highest esteem. The Taliban promote them in their videos and in photographs, and on Voice of Jihad, they'll write stories about them. They're upheld as making the ultimate sacrifice for within. They're the example for all the Taliban and any sympathizer to follow. It's Mullah Habibullah Akhundzada hit the current emir of the Taliban. His son conducted a suicide attack in Helmand and was praised for doing that. That's how committed the Taliban are to this tactic, and they use it, and they use it very effectively in Afghanistan.
Akhundzada sacrificed his son in a suicide bombing, but we're supposed to believe he's going to compromise on behalf of his organization and merge his outfit into some sort of democratically elected government in Afghanistan, although the Taliban strenuously denies that democracy has any religious legitimacy whatsoever, and is constantly critiquing this as a Western import that is of the infidels and illegitimate, So it's one of the sort of many incongruities in the talks of the Taliban, which we've criticized, is that this idea that Habibullah Akhundzada is going to let his son go out and blow himself up, but yet he's going to sort of come to the peace table in a meaningful way and really compromise in a fundamental way on his religious sort of commitments and ideology. I just don't see it. I know you don't either, Bill.
No, look, and the Taliban said this in 2016, and it's repeated this. It said, this is the own Taliban, I'm paraphrasing, but their own words. They're not making these sacrifices, waging decades of jihad for, and this is a direct quote, silly ministerial post. That's the Taliban telling you they're not going to join a government. They want the Islamic Emirate. Look, we've been down that road numerous times on this podcast and at the Long War Journal. So many times that Tom and I are sick of writing about it, to be honest with you. But that's the established fact of that.
But Bill, do you mean to tell me that Akhundzada is not going to be the Minister for Health in a new Afghan government, or the head of border security, or he's not going to be the head of foreign affairs or something like that for a new Afghan government? You don't think Akhundzada is willing to play that game?
I wouldn't hold my breath. I just do not hold your breath for that one.
Right. I'm not holding my breath either. You'd be passed out if you were trying to play that game over and over again. Yeah. So in any event, I was talking to reporters about this, and I said, I asked the question, why is it this April 2019 attack is the one that's suspected of being funded by Russian bounties, when you can point to this whole series of other attacks in or near Bagram through the years? I still haven't gotten an answer as to why this attack in particular is suspected. I mean, there could be specific intelligence, of course, that's saying that there's a reason to. But one reporter said to me, well, Americans were killed. I just thought, well, come on, I mean, it's not like the Taliban hasn't killed Americans in other operations in 2019 and before. I mean, of course they have, It was in September of last year, of course. President Trump temporarily suspended the quote-unquote talks, the negotiations, I'm going to say quote-unquote peace talks, again, withdrawal talks with the Taliban in September of last year when the Taliban claimed responsibility for a suicide bombing in Kabul that killed an American.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. Look, I believe last year was the highest number of American soldiers killed in Afghanistan since about somewhere around 2012 or 13, if I recall. I'd have to go back and check that, but it was a very high year. So, again, why this particular attack? Look, General McKenzie himself, who is the head of CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, he said that he's not seeing any evidence that a single attack has been linked to the Taliban. So I just wondering why, you're right. I mean, why pull out this specific attack? All we're just told that this is one of those attacks, but we're not given any specific evidence on this. And I just find that to be very curious.
Well, again, now we'll adjust our views if evidence comes to light. Of course, that's what you're supposed to do. But we just don't have any right now. The other thing is, McKenzie's comments immediately, I immediately was texting friends and emailing that around because he used a phrase that was similar to something I used. And so this is self-serving in pointing this out, but so what? He said that he hadn't seen a causative link between the Russian bounties being offered and operations. I had previously written something. I have this newsletter now at the Dispatch, this new publication run by our friend Steve Hayes, called Vital Interests, and I cover China and Russia and all these other different topics, but of course I can't get away from the jihadi stuff. And I did a newsletter last week about several days before McKenzie's comments, and I said, what's missing here is the chain of causality. And so it was a similar phrase to what McKenzie used. He used causative link, I used chain of causality. That's sort of what's missing here, right? Is that we don't really know, how these alleged Russian bounties actually had any kind of operational impact.
It's astounding, but yes, go ahead, Tom.
Now, some would say, well, that doesn't really matter. The fact of the bounties being offered is what matters. And some friends of mine have said that. And I would say, look, if I were a policymaker in charge or the president, which is, of course, never going to happen, but if I were in any one of those roles, and I got any kind of intelligence, or my people underneath me got any kind of intelligence coming from any quarter of threatening Americans, I'd take that as a top priority. I want to lock it down as quickly as possible. What's going on? And that's sort of what's going on here. Is this is sort of a political argument to say that's framed within the Russia-Trump narrative to say that Trump dropped the ball on this and his administration dropped the ball on this. But when you can't show any casualties, then what did they really drop the ball on? What did they fail to stop? And when you look at it too, one of the stories I think is curious, and this isn't a defense of Trump. My views on him and his administration. There's plenty of stuff to critique there, and we have been critical. But when you look at the whole picture and you look at everything that's going on here, the idea that Russia stands out as sort of the prime bad actor in the front page news, that's sort of what I think kind of drew your skepticism and criticism right away, Bill, because we've been covering this for so many years, and the idea that Russia commands so much attention when you and I know very well, and the U.S. government knows very well, that the prime sponsor of the Taliban is Pakistan, our punitive ally. Why don't you go off on Pakistan for a little bit, Bill?
Yeah, exactly. And again, this is how I knew this was a political story first and foremost. It's if they cared so much about American journalists and politicians cared so much about bounties being offered by Russia and yet can't link a single attack to this whole thing, then, where's the outrage over Pakistan and its support for the Taliban over the years? You've had 3 successive administrations provide billions upon billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars per year to Pakistan, obviously, while Pakistan was directly responsible for the death of every American soldier killed in a Taliban attack inside Afghanistan. Obviously, the Islamic State also has targeted and killed Americans, so we can't blame that on Pakistan. Although I would say that by them permitting the Taliban to survive, it allowed the Islamic State to rise. Look,
Yeah, I would say ISIS grew out of the Pakistani milieu, in
yeah,
part,
exactly,
the
exactly.
sort of permissive
I mean,
environment.
we don't have to go into. We did a whole episode on Pakistan's support for the Taliban. It's
Oh, we're gonna
safe
do it. We're gonna do
havens.
it. We're gonna do it again. We're gonna do it
Yeah,
again. We can't
we
get
have
away
to.
from it. Yeah.
Yeah, this stuff is like a virus. It just doesn't leave. Um, look, it billions upon billions of money to Pakistan while it sponsors the killing of American soldiers. The Taliban leaders and fighters live in Pakistan. So do their families. They receive medical care. They receive training. There's Taliban madrasas all over the place, and particularly in Baluchistan province, and as well as what used to be the Northwest Frontier province. You have recruiting centers. I could just go on and on with Pakistan. The Taliban would be a shell of itself without the Pakistani support. So if journalists and politicians really cared about American soldiers dying in Afghanistan, they would have been screaming about Pakistan time and time again. Every year, every time an American was killed, that would be the story of why do we continue to support Pakistan when it supports the Taliban, which kills American soldiers. And yet they're silent on this issue. And yet they're supportive of signing a withdrawal deal with the Taliban. So, yeah, I just, again, it's Russia plus Trump equals a great story. And like Tom, look, Trump's foreign policy is a nightmare. I mean, it's as bad, and with the signing of the deal with the Taliban, I would say worse than the Obama administration's.
Yeah, you said to me, Bill. You said to me in a text and some other things too that the big scandal here really that should be covered is what's actually in this deal and how bad this deal is with the U.S. and the Taliban. Why isn't that if you want to show Trump's weakness, why not use that as an example? Because there is this sort of, and I am somewhat sympathetic to it, there is sort of an anti-war sentiment in a lot of the reporting. People just sort of want out of Afghanistan, so they're just willing to look the other way. I kind of understand that to an extent. But even so, as you and I have said from the beginning, you can want out of Afghanistan without endorsing this absolution and this sort of complete endorsement of the Taliban as our de facto counterterrorism partner, which is, there's been some reporting, skeptical reporting on that, including in the New York Times. But overall, it isn't the scandal that you would think it would be. Russia seems to immediately eclipse everything. Anytime Russia's thrown into a story, it immediately eclipses all other reporting.
Yeah, again, that's how we know it's political. I mean, let's look at the Iran and its activities inside Afghanistan. Iran, we know, provides training camps, cash to the Taliban, safe haven for Taliban. Now, it's nowhere near the extent of what Pakistan support for the Taliban, but it's certainly far greater than the extent that the Russians provide. There's narcotics going through between the IRGC and the Taliban. We've seen designations on that. President Obama signs a nuclear deal with Iran and provides billions of dollars of cash on pallets, done around the without the knowledge of Congress. And and by the way, Iran is responsible for the murder of over 600 U.S. soldiers inside of Iraq by its sponsorship of the Shia militias. And guess
also,
what?
Also offer bounties to the Taliban as well in Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, folks, did you all know that a news report came out in 2010 that Iran was paying bounties for American soldiers inside Afghanistan? Well, you didn't. And the press didn't make a big stink out of this and talk about how can the President Obama be signing a deal with Iran because Iran is responsible for putting bounties on American soldiers. But, one thing here, we can directly link Iran to the death of over 600 American soldiers inside of Iraq. I mean, we can't link a single attack inside of Afghanistan to Russia, but I can point out multiple attacks where Americans were killed or maimed by the Iranian produced EFPs or those explosive penetrators. So again, it's another way I know that this is a political story, because if you start digging this up on Iran, well, then you must be some warmongering neocon or something like that, because you're pointing out Iran's ties, ties to Shia militias and the support of the Taliban. And, the natural conclusion, I guess, is that we need to go to war with Iran. I would argue we should probably finish the wars that we're doing oh so badly in before starting a new one. Yeah, and I'm not going to belabor this point, but, those are, you want to look at real state sponsorship of terrorism and bounties and support for the Taliban and support for murdering American troops. Look no further than Pakistan and Iran.
Yeah, so, the Iranian stuff, too, by the way, I mean, that was recognized in a series of terrorist designations and other official statements by the Obama administration and then the Trump administration. And these designations go through an interagency process to make sure the intelligence is basically bulletproof, or as close to bulletproof as can be in the intelligence world, and will stand up in a court of law. And that's not the case with the intelligence on the Russian bounties to the Taliban. As you can see, there's some skepticism from the National Security Agency and others as to what exactly happened here. You can see from General McKenzie at CENTCOM and other officials have said, we can't even prove the causal link here. So it's not nearly as strong, I should say. The case against the Russians for the bounties are not nearly as strong. But let me back up for 1 second and say this. None of this is an apology for Putin or Russia, right?
Absolutely not.
No way. Listen, if I were a policymaker and this intelligence came across my desk, even if it was really, I would say, even if it was really sketchy and murky and you couldn't really nail it down, I'd be very concerned about it right away. And I'd want to know more, and I'd want to make sure Americans are protected and that, this isn't going on. The problem is just the lens and framing around it in the context of the Afghan war. This idea that this story pops in ways that other stories, which are more meaningful and more problematic and have a deeper history to them, don't. And sort of certain stories like Pakistan and Iran and what they're doing, that's sort of become just sort of white noise now to the American public and to journalists, I think, overall, and to the media and to policymakers to a large extent, when something like this becomes supposedly the signal we're all supposed to pay attention to. And that's where I think you and I are sort of skeptical about this, right, Bill? That's where we're coming from, is that this is not the end-all, be-all of the war in Afghanistan story. I mean, here's another point about it. One of the things I've seen speculated is this was leaked to keep American troops in Afghanistan. That basically, I guess the theory is that withdrawing now after showing the Russians are trying to chase us out, that this would somehow show weakness, and so therefore Trump is going to, face pressure to stay in. I don't doubt that maybe some officials, I have no reason to doubt, I should say, that some officials may think that way, or some people may think that way, but you and I don't see why this story would keep America in Afghanistan. I mean, this is not exactly, the logic of it doesn't, even though I can see that some people may think that, I don't think the logic holds up to it. There's no real logic to saying, the Russians are trying to kill Americans in Afghanistan, so let's keep them there another 20 years. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, it just...
Yeah. I've heard people argue that this is just yet another reason why we should withdraw from Afghanistan, and I'd be willing to bet that that's what President
Trump reportedly himself, President Trump reportedly himself, that was his reaction. Let's just get out, So why keep him there to be targeted by the Russians? Now President Trump is, of course, he has a bizarre thing, not just with Putin but with other dictators as well, and other tyrants. I mean, he's he's been very deferential to Xi in China. He's been very willing to laud and praise Erdogan in Turkey and Kim in North Korea, and he sort of has this sort of a weird affinity for strongmen and doesn't seem to really appreciate or care that they are bad actors and oftentimes who sponsor anti-American activities. And basically that they don't really stand for anything America stands for. Now, it doesn't mean you have to go to war with all these guys. Absolutely not. But you should be a little more critical, a little less willing to sort of play nice with these guys when they really are not going to play nice with us. And so this brings me to another point here. One of the stories that was built on top of this story, I'm seeing it in a couple different places now. I think Just Security had a report on this, and then some others, was that basically Trump was encouraging the CIA to provide intelligence to the Russians even after this bounty story on counterterrorism in the counterterrorism realm, and that the U.S. got nothing back in return. I don't doubt that this was a one-way street. I mean, that sounds right to me. The Russians probably don't provide us with any good intelligence, or very little, right, Bill? I think they probably are not looking to help us at all.
No, look, I think there's certainly animosity from the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, during the Soviet occupation and whatnot. So yeah, I think I definitely think the Russians love to see the United States stew in its failure in Afghanistan, without a doubt. So yeah, I would certainly believe that the Russians would not provide us with intelligence, or if they did provide anything, it would be useless.
Yeah, but the one thing I would add to those stories that we're seeing reported is that it's not true that there's nothing to worry about or no intelligence issues here or terrorism issues here to be concerned with. I mean, Al Qaeda or Al Qaeda affiliated groups and ISIS have both launched attacks in Russia, in Chechnya, and Dagestan. One of the things that President Trump, people have forgotten this already, and probably because it's President Trump, but he was quick to claim credit for providing the Russians with intelligence that stymied an attack in St. Petersburg in the last couple of years. We know that Al Qaeda affiliated groups have been targeting St. Petersburg. They've also claimed operations in Moscow and St. Petersburg through the years. There is a constant stream of threats there, or a stream of real terrorism threats there that are concerning. And that's not a defense of Putin or the Russian security establishment to point that out. But there is a jihadi threat to Moscow, and there is some overlap between that threat and the threats to us. That doesn't make Moscow a full-fledged counterterrorism partner for the U.S. or anything of the sort, for a whole host of other reasons. But there is an intelligence overlap or component there in the counterterrorism realm, right, Bill? I mean, this goes back to, you were covering. I was thinking about this before we got on the show, and I didn't prep you for this, so we're just going to do this, sort of extemporaneously. Talk a little bit about your coverage of Chechnya through the years, right? And there was always this sort of pushback from some people that basically portrayed the Chechen Jihad as just sort of Putin's machinations and a function of Putin. And it took away agency from these jihadis in Chechnya who were originally sponsored and funded by bin Laden, ironically enough, from Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, by the way. And there was always an Al-Qaeda angle to that. But there was always this idea that they were going to sort of dismiss it as just sort of Putin's sort of machinations as opposed to a real story there. Right, Bill?
Yeah, so the common narrative was that the Russians were just making up what was happening in Chechnya and beyond. Dagestan and other territories as well, but the reality is because the Russians, what these people wanted to say is, oh, they're all just Chechen rebel groups. We see this in Syria, right? I mean, attempt to disconnect the dots. Well, yeah, there were Chechen rebel groups who were secular and whatnot, but there also were jihadists there. I mean, look, Zawahiri is reported to have been inside Chechnya.
That story led to a conspiracy theory that he was released by Moscow and then became under his control, right? I mean, that's where this goes. This goes to these sort of conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
That basically Putin is it's the same thing we see with the Assad-ISIS conspiracy theory, that Assad is secretly manipulating and controlling ISIS. I mean, these are all gross distortions of reality by ideologues usually, but go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and so, but look, the Islamic Caucasus Emirates, which seems to be defunct now, was basically an Al-Qaeda branch. I mean, it genuflected to the leadership. Al-Qaeda certainly had nice things to say about it.
Let me add one thing. That the extent to which it was an Al-Qaeda branch was really, I mean, there's a whole dossier that you can do before the rise of ISIS, but when ISIS rose and decided to build its own sort of Caucasus province, it became very clear how much the Islamic Caucasus Emirate was in the Al-Qaeda branch, because Al-Qaeda's global network ran to the Islamic Caucasus Emirate's defense. Now through a series of high-value targeting by Moscow, or taking out leaders of Islamic Caucasus Emirate, and the ISIS challenge. That's why I think it's defunct, as you're saying, or at least it's been suppressed into the shadows, and maybe it'll pop up again one day. But
I haven't seen them claim an operation or anything like that in quite some time. But look, the reality is these guys were intimately linked. You'd have Chechen commanders who were part of the Islamic Caucasus Emirates pop up in Afghanistan, and then as the jihad went on in Syria, you had in the Islamic Caucasus Emirates a branch inside Syria that was closely allied with a key ally with Al Qaeda there. So, yeah, but this narrative, it's just, as you said, it took away agency from jihadists there. But the reality is they were quite an active. They had a quite active presence there, and were not just conducting attacks in Dagestan and Chechnya and Nagorno-Karabakh and other areas, but they were conducting attacks inside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. As you remember, they hit the Moscow subway and all
they had the Black
attacks.
Widows, or the Black Widows, right? These were the widows of the suicide bombers or others who died or were killed for fighting for the Islamic Caucasus Emirate. So I mean, they had that whole thing. By the way, I should inject this point here. In a previous episode, you were mentioning your admiration for the Islamic Caucasus Emirates merch. And again, they had merch, but we don't. So, as of yet. So, Phil, you can help us please rectify the situation. But here's the one thing, Phil.
I think we should
Phil,
definitely.
No. You're not getting your way. You're not getting your Islamic Caucasus Emirate inspired merchandise. We're not doing that. So, Phil, whatever you do,
leopard spotted Generation Jihad mug or something like that.
Phil, whatever you do, whatever Bill sends you, you have to send to me. And if you Google the image and it looks anything like the Islamic Caucasus Emirate stuff, it's immediately nixed. I'm vetoing it right away. Okay, that's the bottom line. So we do not have any. There's nothing with like the little mountain scroll on it or anything like that, or the leopard skin or the big puffy hats and stuff. We're not doing any of that,
You're just hating on the jihadi cool, Tom. I'm sorry.
Well, you can define it as jihadi cool, but we're not going to go down that road. But in any event, one of the things that's funny about that too is that, one of the arguments was the Islamic Caucasus Emirate was just and the Chechen jihadists were just national jihadists, and you see that argument even after they pop up in Syria and fighting Assad, in Syria. Now there is a Russian angle to that because Russia's sponsoring Assad, of course, and is the main sponsor for the barbarity and the genocide in Syria, but. That wasn't purely tied to the Russia's efforts that they were there. They were there before that, and you had guys, who also were folded up into ISIS operations. We previously talked about Abu Omar al-Shashani, who was the sort of Georgian Chechen fighter. Was trained by the military in Georgia. I think was even trained by U.S. Special Forces there, and sort of a program, and then becomes one of the chief military commanders for ISIS.
But he was Islamic Caucasus Emirates and
then
Syria
defected
before doing that,
right. And then defected and became a big ISIS guy. The idea that these are all sort of just national sort of fighters, nationalist fighters who aren't invested in the jihadi ideology. I mean, it's just bunk. I mean, there's just so many different examples of why that's wrong. That doesn't again excuse anything Putin does or justification for Putin, but you got to be able to say sometimes the enemy of my enemy is just our enemy. It's not our friend. And that's just the way the world works. But we also talked a little bit about when we were prepping for the show. The other states that have sort of dabbled in sponsoring the Taliban through the years. Of course, Qatar was very keen to open the political office in Doha for the Taliban and has had a permissive fundraising environment for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other jihadis through the years. I think there was reporting from pro-Qatar sources, but still, I don't think it's wrong that the UAE was even trying to compete for the Taliban office at one point before it was open, the political office. So even though the UAE and Qatar are sort of rivals now, they were basically competing to openly host the Taliban. Saudi Arabia, we know, has popped up as a fundraising network for opportunity for the Haqqanis and other Taliban groups that they haven't been necessarily as vigilant as they should have been in cracking down on that stuff. And of course, there's a whole historical narrative there that sort of hasn't been solved going back to the 1980s. But Bill, the bottom line is, right, you have all these different players who are involved in this nastiness in Afghanistan. It isn't like Russia's the only thing that stands out.
Yeah, right. And I think it's key to understand sort of what I call the hierarchy of the state's support for the Taliban. And certainly Pakistan tops the list. And by several degrees of magnitude over the next guy, which would be Iran, right? And we discussed why previously. Then I'd probably argue that Qatar would be next, given that they've hosted the political office. They've allowed the Taliban to fundraise there, to recruit there. Senior Taliban figures live there. Remember the Bo Bergdahl deal, where he was the American soldier who was traded for the notorious Taliban 5. Where did they go? They went to Qatar. Then, in Saudi Arabia, they allow, it's not more direct state sponsorship with the Saudis, more of a look the other way type of sponsorship.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically permissive for fundraising. It's
permissive Yeah,
we don't
exactly.
we don't
For
have, we don't have anything
fundraising
we don't have anything linking Saudis to operations in Afghanistan or anything like that.
Right.
And you can look at the 9/11 Commission report and other sources, and there was a falling out between Saudi Arabia and the Taliban at times over the issue of Bin Laden and Al Qaeda being in Afghanistan. So there is real tensions there too. But the bottom line is Saudi Arabia has provided a permissive operating environment at times for Taliban fundraisers.
Yep. And look, so if I'm to look at Russia in this hierarchy, I probably put it somewhere between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And by the way, we have a large U.S. naval base and a U.S. Central Command is based out of Qatar, right? Where's the outrage over that? We signed billion-dollar deals, multi-billion-dollar deals with Saudi Arabia for weapons, and Saudi Arabia, U.S. provides support and basically is the Saudis' security guarantee in the Gulf, again, primarily against Iran. Where's the outrage over this in the media? Why Russia and not these four countries?
Yeah, well, we know why, because Russia. I mean, this is the defining era. I mean, you go back through the whole thing. Again, this isn't a defense of President Trump or the Trumpists, and you have some of these reflexive people out there who defend him, right? And some of the things he's said and done when it comes to Putin and Russia are sort of disturbing to me, of course, sort of too full of praise at times. But, if you look back at the reporting, in my view, it was definitely overinflated. I mean, the idea that, you had big time reporters arguing he was Putin's apprentice, and that he was sort of, implementing, he was some sort of agent of the Kremlin and all sorts of allegations about funding and everything else. Now, I mean, if there's real evidence for anything, hey, I'm willing to entertain or change my mind at any point in time based on real evidence. But this whole thing was just overblown in my view. And some of what was done on the Russia stuff. That doesn't mean that there wasn't some bad stuff there with WikiLeaks and other aspects of the story. I think there was. I'm certainly always sensitive to any kind of foreign influence or foreign interference. I'm always quick to want to reject that and fight back. But the idea that he was the stooge of Putin, I think he's more. I think it's his own peculiar worldview and foreign approach to foreign affairs, and his willingness to sort of, bow down before a lot of different dictators and praise them is sort of what's most disturbing to me. And look, you want to talk about subservience. Look at the Taliban U.S. withdrawal deal on February 29th. It doesn't get much more servile than that, does it?
No, it doesn't. And and again, I'm going to go back to Iran. You want to look at subservience to a regime. What did what Obama did by negotiating with Iran and cutting that nuclear deal? That's horrific. That's bad foreign policy. Again, no outrage over that. So that to me, my whole complaint about this is the lack of proportionality and the lack of perspective. And they really made a mountain out of a molehill here. If you want to complain about the murder, and look, I hope I don't sound overly animated here, but we're talking about the death of American soldiers here, and that I take that personally. It upsets me. These are my brothers and sisters that the Taliban is killing and that states are sponsoring. And so when you take an issue that really has no real, we can't even link a single attack.
So far, there's no there, right?
Yeah,
so far.
Right. And you elevate that while ignoring basically all of these very real problems that are ongoing to this day. Yeah, I'm going to get pissed off.
I don't know. I think that covers the Russian bounty issues. Is there anything else you want to add to it?
I think so.
I'm going to leave it on the pissed off comment. Yeah, it's good.
All right, that's an appropriate ending.
Yeah. So speaking of the Taliban, because we can't get away from this. So just this last week, a couple days before we recorded this, Caleb Weiss, who is a grad student, has been writing for us for several years, and he follows all these jihadis on social media with us and works with us on this stuff. He did a simple write-up of Katibat Imam al-Bukhari. Katibat Imam al-Bukhari, this sort of Imam al-Bukhari battalion, this sort of Uzbek group that spun off from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. Their emir in Syria posted these photos claiming that this joint raid with the Taliban, where the Imam al-Bukhari's guys had jointly participated in this operation to capture Afghans with the Taliban. And so, Caleb wrote up a very simple article saying, here's what they're claiming, here's what they say. And the Taliban could not contain itself, right? On Twitter, their social media account, which is disturbingly well followed, Their guy Zabihullah Mujahid, who's really probably several people who operate under that name, but the spokesman for the Taliban quickly said this is propaganda by anti-peace circles, to basically to thwart peace efforts or something like that. And this was stolen from our archive, which, wow, I gotta give Caleb credit. I mean, he must be one hell of a computer hacker we didn't know about, that he can dip into the Taliban's archives and pull out photos like that. In reality, of course, it wasn't stolen from any archive. It was on Telegram. Caleb subsequently wrote up the Taliban's ridiculous denial, showing a screenshot of where it came from. Came from this Telegram feed for this emir for the Imam al-Bukhari outfit in Syria. And but it just struck me, again, a couple things struck me about this bill. One is how sensitive the Taliban is to any just basic observations about foreign jihadis in Afghanistan. There's no real dispute over the fact that these Uzbeks are there. I mean, you got the UN, U.S. sources, their own propaganda, their own statements. Prior to these recent talks with the U.S., the Taliban never challenged any of the claims by Imam al-Bukhari. It's only in the context now, really, of the February 29th withdrawal deal that they're just desperate to say, oh, these are anti-peace circles. And you had a funny observation, though, about that bill, claiming that we're part of the anti-peace circles when they just committed a suicide bombing the other day, right? I mean, who's anti-peace here, right?
I mean, it is astounding, right? They're continuing their attacks, and look, nobody would be more happy to see peace in Afghanistan than you and I, because we'd love to stop reporting about it. But the reality is the reality. And the Taliban, look, I believe you, Caleb, and I were texting the night that he did that, and we predicted that the Taliban would respond.
Oh, it was obvious. It was obvious, yeah. Of course they would. And he knew that, too, writing it up, which is great. We're going to have Caleb on the show sometime in the future to talk about his career writing for us at Unanswered Journal, and we got some funny. This is yet another funny episode of all this. But he and I, last year he and I reported on, it was a similar piece on the Turkestan Islamic Party, the Uyghur outfit in Afghanistan, was claiming operations and publishing photos. And the Taliban did the same thing. This is, put up by the anti-peace crowd and everything else. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was put up by the Turkestan Islamic Party, your long-running ally, who is beholden to Abatullah Akhundzada and fights in the Taliban's ranks in Afghanistan. This didn't come from Unanswered Journal. The Imam al-Bukhari stuff didn't come from Unanswered Journal. The Turkestan Islamic Party stuff didn't come from Unanswered Journal. We're just simply saying what they're saying, reporting on what they're saying, and they quickly denied that they were there. But, here, this leads me to the other aspect of this bill, which is why you and I think this is really a lost war effort. Why in the hell is it left to a grad student to report on what's on Telegram about foreign jihadis in Afghanistan to spark this? I mean, yes, this is our specialty. This is what we do, right? Okay, fine. But then nobody pushes back on this other than us. So the Taliban immediately springs into its counter messaging, which is all filled with lies, to basically say these guys aren't there and this is all put up by the anti-peace crowd. Where's the State Department calling out the Taliban for their lies? Where's the Defense Department calling out the Taliban for the lies? Where's the information aspect of the warfare of all this, right? It isn't there. It's non-existent. You have a grad student and us, a couple of guys in the Northeast corridor here of the United States, just saying what's on Telegram. And the U.S. government is so uninvested in this war effort and trying to counter the Taliban's disinformation that nobody else says anything about it. Right, Bill?
Yeah. I mean, I bet you this is it because it exposes uncomfortable truths, right? The Taliban is still dealing with foreign fighters, but that would mean they'd be reneging on that withdrawal deal where the Taliban's not supposed to be sponsoring these guys and allowing them to be conducting attacks. So yeah,
I'm sure Zalmay Khalilzad's all over this, right, Bill? He's got to be.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure he's holding their feet to the fire on this one and all the other examples they claim Al Qaeda's not in Afghanistan. I'm sure Zal's right on top of it, aren't you, Zal?
Yep. No, I'm sure he is. I mean, I'm sure he's very concerned that the Taliban's calling out a couple of Americans and calling us liars for reporting what is essentially the truth. And speaking of the issue of liars,
well, it's reporting what the jihadis and the Taliban's own allies are saying. So, putting aside whether it's the truth or not, this isn't originating with us. That's the whole funny part about all this,
Right. So they have this is a point that I made when they denied that Al Qaeda was operating inside Afghanistan. They're basically calling all of their allies liars because their allies are, probably a little bit of problems with message control here. The Taliban doesn't want to advertise these ties because it causes issues. So and then to deal with that, they basically have to say, Al Qaeda, you're lying. You're not in Afghanistan. Iman al-Barkari, even though your Emir published this, you're a liar. And, Turkestan Islamic Party, you're a liar as well. That's what the Taliban is doing.
That's the implicit allegation, right? It's not explicit. Explicit, they're calling us liars. They're calling us the antics. Right. They're not actually saying that about their own allies. But the point you're making is, if anybody's lying here, Zabihullah, if anybody's lying here, it's your own allies, not us, right? Your own allies are the ones that are lying, not us, So that's the point, is that they're not actually drawing the iron. Now Caleb subsequently saw that the Imam al-Bukhari guys took down, the one guy took this down off a Telegram throughout all this. It shows how they wanted to cover it up. And of course, the original photos had their branding on it and everything else. And the Taliban released Zabihullah's account, released what's the so-called original version of the photo, which is funny because if it is the original version of the photo, and I have no reason to doubt that it is, they've sort of inadvertently just confirmed that they've been working with Imam al-Bukhari, right?
Exactly. I found that hilarious.
Here's the original. Well, thanks, Taliban. Now we got the original. It just shows that, the Imam al-Bukhari has their version with their watermarks all over it and their writing all over it. Now you're just releasing the original for us. You're just confirming the two of you are in cahoots. And by the way, I haven't seen you do anything to actually distance yourself from these Uzbeks in Afghanistan. Quite the contrary. But that's why this is so... I saw some of the social media reaction. There's some, the people on. I mean, listen, when I say these people are idiots, they really are idiots. I mean, there are people on social media, and Phil, you can leave this in this time. There are people on social media who are idiots. I mean, this is just the way it is, the nature of the beast. And you can see these people, saying, "Oh, Long War Journal," trying to report, for war or whatever. I just, trying to advocate for war or something like that, or we're lying to say this, right? It's so funny. It's so ridiculous because. Do you think, Bill, that anybody in America wants to stay in Afghanistan to fight the Imam al-Bukhari battalion? You think anybody even knows what that is or even cares? No. That's what's so funny about the Taliban's reaction to all this, right? The fact of the matter is that if Caleb had wrote this up and they never said a word, it would have just disappeared into the ether. Nobody would have cared. It would have picked up in some official report somewhere, probably, as a footnote to say, oh yeah, by the way, the Taliban is still working with these guys, and they haven't really broke with them at all. But if the Taliban, this is one of those cases where their public relations department needs a little lesson in corporate spin that you get here in the U.S., right? It's better to ignore stuff, right, when it's inconvenient than to actually blow it up. And I mean, it's fun. I shouldn't say that because I love the fact that they lie in response to our reporting.
Yes.
But it's just so funny because, I mean, it's so ridiculous that anybody would, this is the card we're going to play, Bill. Is we're going to count on Imam al-Bukhari, but the Imam al-Bukhari battalion to keep the war going. Yeah, right,
The Taliban really needs to learn the lesson of not punching down. And let's face it, we're not running an insurgency with 100,000 troops, with a sophisticated media department publishing dozens of reports of attacks and videos and photographs and all that. But yet the Taliban feels a need to punch down with us, and it's not the first time. And I find that quite amusing.
I wouldn't say punch down. I wouldn't say punch down.
Talking in terms of reach and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, no, I guess in that. I mean, the bottom line is we're the only ones who are actually reporting any of this stuff, in any systematic way, which is, again, I think is evidence of a lost war effort, right? I mean, nobody even is even questioning stuff. I mean, you have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo goes out there and he says, I've seen evidence that the Taliban is working to destroy Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I mean, that's an incredible thing to say. He said that just a couple weeks ago. Release the evidence or give us some examples of what you show, or let's see some evidence of that, because that would be the greatest betrayal in the jihadi world of all time. And yet we haven't seen any evidence of that. But he says that, and there's some mild skepticism in the press, but beyond that, nothing, right? But then this Russia bounty story commands multiple hearings and, front page news. And, it's totally out of perspective, right?
You're absolutely right, Tom. I mean, if the Taliban is going up against Al-Qaeda, don't you think, if I was a congressman, I'd want to know that, right? I mean, even if it was a behind-the-scenes classified hearing, that's real news.
Right. I would love to report on that. The Taliban's actually betraying Al-Qaeda? Wow. Then that is an incredible diplomatic accomplishment, which the Trump administration and Pompeo should take, and Zalmay Khalilzad should take credit for. However, if you're making it up or you're grossly exaggerating some fragmentary piece of intelligence, which is what I suspect, then you're just lying on behalf of the Taliban, right? And what is the incentive for that? That's certainly not necessary to get out of Afghanistan.
Wait, blowing up a fragmentary piece of intelligence? That's interesting.
Where could that possibly be in play? Could that possibly have something to do with the Russian bounty story? I think so.
Yeah. I want to make one more point about that whole thing. I am just tired of this leaky nature of intelligence, because if there was anything to this story, once it's blown up like this, it becomes extremely difficult to prosecute the leads on this. And this just dripping of intelligence for political purposes, this needs to stop. It's very concerning. This is the kind of things that every American, I don't care what your political affiliation, should be concerned about. If this happened under the Obama administration, I'd be disgusted. If it happened under the Bush administration, I'd be disgusted. And under the Trump administration, you should be disgusted too. This is not how our intelligence services should work. This is using intelligence for nefarious political purposes is just flat out wrong, and it should be illegal, and people should be prosecuted for this.
Well, what I would say is, if there was, I don't want to justify leaking, but if there was a there that you could show, something that there was a willful blindness by President Trump and his administration to intelligence that was threatening Americans and was leading to American deaths, I wouldn't have nearly the problem I have with it being leaked to the press, right? If there's something you can show a real impact. The problem is that when you pick this piece of intelligence, this select piece of intelligence, which is fragmentary, as you've said, Bill, and doesn't have any causal link to anything else, and is sort of just a minor part of the picture in Afghanistan at this point compared to the broad picture of what we're seeing, then there's an obvious sort of politicized dynamic in play here. And that's what's problematic about this, because because it doesn't, everything is being sort of viewed through that Russia-Trump lens as opposed to sort of the real Afghan war lens and what's really going on.
Yep, Tom, as always, you say it far better than I can.
I don't know. We've gotten some complaints, by the way, that I talk too fast. I've seen that. Yes, I do talk too fast. So and the other thing,
have to slow it down.
I can't. I'm a fast talking New Yorker, and I drink too much coffee before we do this. I've already had 3 cups, and I'm drinking the high octane stuff too. So I do talk.
So Tom,
fast.
We got to get you drinking out of those leopard skin.
I swear
Generation
to God,
Jihad mugs. I'm telling you, man.
You keep bringing up this Islamic Caucus of Emirate merch, I'm going to lose my mind, because we're not doing that. So it's not going to happen. All right. And quite frankly, after all these years, my friend, I find it disturbing that you still like that.
I do too, by the way.
So one other person online said we complain a lot during the podcast. He liked the podcast, but we complain a lot. I don't know. I think we do complain a lot at times. But we're also critiquing what we're going on. We see a lot of failed efforts here, and I think criticism and skepticism are sort of necessary to cover all this stuff. Even when we agree with something, there are reasons to be skeptical or critical of what's going on. We do sort of complain though at times, for sure, because we see some fundamental failures here, right, Bill? That's what bothers us, bothers you and me, is to see this sort of just total incompetence at times. We just go ahead. Sorry.
No, that is the problem. I mean, it's this war is lost, and I'm not talking just about Afghanistan. And it's frustrating to watch. It's frustrating to see. Look, Tom and I are no stranger to optimism. When General Petraeus was trying to put together the surge back in 2006, Tom and I were among the people that you could fit in a phone booth who supported it and saw that there was, that there could be positive outcomes to this. So, and I think there were until the legs were cut out from under it. So, if we see something good, we're going to talk about it, but we see a lot of problems, and, I don't view it as complaining. I just think we're just talking about the reality of the situation, and the reality is that things look pretty damn bad right now.
And look, I'll just leave this thought on this one point. Just last week, we had Sarah Carlson on, who was a wonderful guest, and I'm really proud of that podcast just because I think her story is fascinating, and she has a great book out there everybody should go get. She's a former CIA officer. She came to the same conclusion we did. She doesn't believe in America's ability to lead in all these places, right? She didn't believe American leadership let her down, and let her CIA colleagues down in Libya, in a different theater. And
you couldn't have had a more optimistic, willing servant to the American public than Sarah. And, again, everyone should read her book, In the Dark of War. And it broke her. And it's very sad to see. And
well, I think it broke her faith in American
her
leadership.
faith in in our ability to wage war. She's certainly a fantastic person. I'm talking specifically in terms of, again, in faith in our leadership and our ability to fight these wars. And look, that's what Tom and I see in abundance. And if we didn't call it like we see it, what are we here for?
Yeah, and that's why we bring up the point that we're the ones left talking about the Taliban's lies when it comes to Al Qaeda or the Imam al-Bukhari Battalion or other groups, Turkestan Islamic Party in Afghanistan. Nobody in American leadership is calling them out on that. Certainly not the State Department. So if that's not a failure of leadership, I don't know what it is. But I think we will leave it on that cheery note for this week. As I say, warn you people all the time, if you're turning this podcast to be, if your spirit's uplifted, you're turning into the wrong place, right? We're here to talk about some dark issues in jihadism and terrorism and what's going on. Try and bring a little humor to it, but it's these are not cheery stories. So I think we'll leave it on that note.
Sounds good, Tom.
All right, so thank you to our audience again for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. In the future, we are going to have some merch that will not be inspired by Caucus Jihadists, and we are going to also ask for some donations, and we'll do that in future episodes, and we hope you guys will show us some support, show us some love. But until that time, we'll see you again next week.